Welcome, dear listener. You have found your way to a story that does not begin with a scream, though there is one eventually. It begins instead with silence, the particular kind of silence that settles over a house when something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong, the kind that hums beneath the floorboards and presses against the window panes and makes the candles gutter for no reason at all. Tonight, we step inside Ashworth Manor, a house of old money, older grudges, and a wedding that never quite made it to the vows. A bride was found this morning, behind her veil, still wearing it, and the veil, they say, was whispering. Before we begin, if this kind of story finds a place in your heart, the fog, the manor, the quiet menace of a family that smiles too perfectly at dinner, then stay with us. Share this with someone who loves a mystery told slowly, told properly, the way mysteries deserve to be told. Now then, shall we begin? The morning the fog came in. The fog had settled over Ashworth Manor sometime before dawn, and by 7 o'clock it had made itself entirely at home. It pressed flat against every window. It swallowed the garden hedges whole. It turned the long gravel driveway into a grey corridor that seemed to lead nowhere in particular, or perhaps somewhere one ought not to go. The oaks that line the eastern wall had disappeared entirely. Even the weather vane atop the old stable roof had vanished, and with it any sense that the world beyond the manor's stone walls still existed at all. Inside, however, the world existed with considerable noise. The wedding had been planned for 11:30. The Ashworth family had spared nothing. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, the mother of the groom, a woman constructed entirely of good posture and quiet disapproval, had seen to that personally. The flowers had arrived from London the previous afternoon, white roses, gardenias, and something exotic that nobody could name but everyone agreed was very expensive. The dining room had been converted into a banquet hall. The minister had arrived the evening before and had been installed in the east guest room with a pot of tea and a worn copy of his sermon notes. The groom, Mr. Edmund Ashworth, 29 years old and possessed of his mother's cheekbones and his late father's unfortunate habit of drinking before noon, had been dressed and ready by 9 o'clock. He had stood in the front parlour with a glass of something amber-coloured and stared at the fog outside the window as though it had personally offended him. The bride, Miss Rosalind Ferrers, had been in her room. Also everyone assumed. It was the housemaid, a thin girl named Dotty, who found her. Dotty had been sent up at 9:15 with a breakfast tray, soft-boiled eggs, buttered toast, and a small pot of Darjeeling, because Miss Rosalind had mentioned the previous evening that she was too nervous to eat anything substantial. Dotty had climbed the stairs carefully, balancing the tray, and had knocked twice at the door of the Primrose Room, so called for the pale yellow wallpaper that had been there since before anyone at Ashworth could remember. There had been no answer. Dotty had knocked again, then a third time, with slightly more urgency, because the eggs would go cold, and cold eggs on a wedding morning seemed to her an omen of some kind. Though she could not have said precisely what kind, still nothing. She had tried the handle. The door was unlocked. The Primrose Room was large, as guest rooms went, large enough to contain a 4-poster bed, a writing desk, a wardrobe of dark mahogany, and a dressing table crowded with the small feminine architecture of a bride's preparations. Perfume bottles, a powder compact, 2 hairpins that had fallen and been left where they lay, a pair of white gloves still folded. The wedding dress was hanging on the wardrobe door, or rather, it had been. It was no longer there. Dotty noticed this first, in the strange sideways way one notices things before one's mind is quite ready to receive them. The dress was gone from the wardrobe, that was odd. That was the first odd thing. The second odd thing was the window. It was open. Just slightly. Perhaps 3 inches, and the fog was pressing in through the gap like a slow grey breath. The curtains shifted softly. The room was cold in a way that had nothing to do with October. The third thing, the thing that made Dotty set the breakfast tray down on the writing desk with a clatter that sent the teapot lid spinning, was the figure seated in the chair before the dressing table mirror. Miss Rosalind Ferrers was sitting perfectly upright. She was dressed in her wedding gown. The veil was arranged over her face, and she was entirely, absolutely, and irreversibly still. Dotty's scream brought 3 people to the corridor within 60 seconds. The first was Edmund Ashworth himself, who had heard it from the parlour below and had taken the stairs 2 at a time, his untouched drink abandoned on the mantelpiece. He arrived at the doorway of the Primrose Room, looked inside, and went the colour of old plaster. The second was Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, who appeared from the direction of the linen cupboard. She had been checking for the fourth time that morning that the good tablecloths had been properly pressed, and who, upon seeing what Dotty was pointing at with a trembling finger, said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Close that window." Nobody moved to close the window. The third was a man named Gerald Harwick, the bride's uncle, her only living family of consequence, who had travelled down from Edinburgh specifically for the occasion, and who had been occupying the room at the far end of the corridor. He arrived last, tying the belt of his dressing gown, and when he saw Rosalind in the chair, he made a sound that was not quite a word and was not quite a sob, and was entirely unlike anything Dotty had ever heard from a grown man. He pushed past Edmund. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He reached out toward the veil. "Do not touch anything." The voice came from the doorway. All of them turned. Standing in the corridor, slightly out of breath from the stairs, he had been, it would later emerge, attempting to locate the kitchen in order to request a proper cup of coffee, a quest which had taken him past 4 wrong doors. Was a small, neat, rather damp Belgian gentleman, with a magnificent moustache and the expression of a man who has just realised that his morning has taken a significant turn for the worse. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the figure in the chair, and he looked at the veil. He looked very briefly at the open window and at the fog still curling through it. Then he said in a voice that was quiet and precise and left absolutely no room for argument, "My name is Hercule Poirot, and I would ask, very kindly you understand, that no one touches anything, moves anything, or says anything to anyone until I have had the opportunity to think." He paused. "Also," he added, almost to himself, smoothing the left side of his moustache with one finger, "I would still very much like that coffee." The local constabulary arrived 40 minutes later, which Poirot considered both predictable and unfortunate. Inspector Graves, a broad, red-faced man from the village of Corton, 3 miles distant, arrived with 2 constables in the immediate, and unshakable conviction that he was the most important person in the room. Poirot let him have that conviction, for now. It cost nothing, and it was frequently useful. He had spent the 40 minutes doing what he did best, which was standing very still in the centre of the primrose room and looking at things that other people had already looked at and not properly seen. The veil, for instance. It was a fine thing, ivory silk, perhaps 2 yards in length, edged with a delicate border of lace that had clearly cost someone a considerable sum. It had been arranged with care over Rosalind's face and hair, not thrown, not draped carelessly in some moment of struggle. Arranged, with patience, with something that might, in another context, have resembled tenderness. Poirot found this deeply troubling. Beneath the veil, the preliminary examination, conducted by the village doctor who had arrived with the inspector and smelled faintly of his own breakfast, confirmed what Poirot had already suspected from the doorway. Rosalind Ferrers had been strangled. The ligature mark was narrow, consistent, deliberate. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken objects, no defensive marks on her hands that the doctor could immediately identify. She had been seated, or had been placed seated, in the chair before the mirror. The window had been opened from the inside. There was no one on the grounds below. The fog had been checked, the gravel examined. No footprints, no disturbed earth beneath the window. Whoever had done this had not come in through the window. They had left through the door, and they had been, at the time of the murder, already inside Ashworth Manor. Poirot stood at the dressing table for a long moment. The fog pressed against the glass. The curtain shifted, and then he saw it. A thing so small that Inspector Graves had walked past it twice without a glance. Tucked beneath the powder compact, as though slipped there deliberately, or perhaps dropped in haste. A single folded square of paper, cream-coloured, the size of a calling card. He did not touch it yet. He simply looked at it. Then he turned and found Dotty still standing near the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, eyes very wide. "The household," he said to her gently. "How many persons were sleeping in this house last night?" Dotty counted on her fingers, which Poirot did not find encouraging but waited patiently for nonetheless. 9, she said at last. "Not counting yourself, sir." "And not counting Rosalind. Miss Ferrers, I mean." 9, Poirot repeated quietly. He looked once more at the veiled figure in the chair. "Then," he said very softly, "one of 9 people in this house has done a very careful, very deliberate, and very personal thing. He retrieved a handkerchief from his breast pocket, not to touch anything, simply to have something in his hands, a habit he'd had for 30 years and saw no reason to abandon now. And the veil, he murmured, almost to himself. Why the veil? Why arrange it so precisely after? Nobody answered him, but then he hadn't expected them to. That was rather the point. The little grey cells go to work. Hercule Poirot did not like Ashworth Manor. This was not a matter of aesthetics. The manor was perfectly acceptable as English country houses went. Stone-faced, ivy-crawled, possessed of the particular gravity that comes from having absorbed 200 years of English weather and English secrets in roughly equal measure. No, what Poirot did not like about Ashworth Manor was the feeling it gave him. The feeling that every room he entered had just, a moment before his arrival, stopped talking. He'd been given the use of the small study off the main corridor, a narrow, book-lined room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. A fire had been lit for him, which he appreciated. The coffee he had eventually been provided was lukewarm and tasted of tin, and which he did not appreciate but chose not to mention, because there were larger matters requiring his attention. He sat behind the desk. He placed his handkerchief precisely in front of him. He rested his fingertips together, and he thought, the note first. He had retrieved it carefully, using the handkerchief touching only the edges, and had examined it before Inspector Graves could develop an interest in it. This was not, technically, entirely proper. Poirot was aware of this. He was also aware that Inspector Graves, upon examining it, would have read it once, announced it was probably nothing, and placed it in a pocket to be forgotten, and so he felt the irregularity was justified. The note contained 4 words, written in a careful, upright hand in blue-black ink that had not smeared, which told him it had been written some hours before and had dried completely before being folded. 4 words. I know about Helen. Nothing more, no signature, no date, no indication of who had written it, or to whom it had been intended, or who, precisely, Helen was. Poirot folded it again and set it on the desk before him. Helen, he thought. He did not know any Helen connected with this household. Not yet, but he would. In his experience, the names one did not yet know were always the most important ones. At 11:30, Poirot began his interviews. He had asked Inspector Graves for the courtesy of speaking with the household members first. Graves had agreed with the slightly suspicious generosity of a man who is quietly relieved to have someone else manage the difficult part. Poirot had thanked him with great warmth and meant none of it. He began, as he always preferred, not with the most obvious suspect, but with the person least likely to be considered one. He began with Dotty. Dorothy Patch, Dotty, was 19 years old and had been employed at Ashworth Manor for 14 months. She sat across from Poirot with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes still carrying that wide, slightly unfocused look of someone whose morning had permanently rearranged their understanding of the world. Poirot offered her a biscuit. She took it and held it without eating it. Tell me, he said gently, about Miss Rosalind. What was she like in these last days before the wedding? Dotty considered this seriously, which Poirot noted with approval. He preferred witnesses who considered things seriously over those who answered immediately. Immediate answers were frequently rehearsed ones. Quiet, Dotty said finally. She was always quiet, Miss Ferrers. Not unfriendly, never that, but sort of contained, like she was keeping herself very carefully inside herself, if you take my meaning. I take your meaning precisely, Poirot said. And in these last days, had this quietness changed? The last 2 days she was tighter, maybe. Like a clock that's been wound too far, she paused. She didn't sleep well. I could hear her sometimes in the night, moving about, and once, the night before last, I heard her voice. She was speaking to someone? I thought so, but when I passed her door in the morning, there was no one about. And I didn't like to ask, she looked down at the untouched biscuit. I should have asked, shouldn't I? It was not quite a question. You could not have known, Poirot said, and meant it. One more thing, Dotty. The window in the Primrose Room. Was it open yesterday evening when you turned down the bed? No, sir, I'm certain of it. I checked the window myself. It was latched. Poirot nodded slowly. Thank you. You've been more helpful than you know. Edmund Ashworth came in next. He was, Poirot thought, a man who had been handsome recently and was in the process of undoing it. He still wore his wedding clothes, the dark morning coat, the white carnation in the buttonhole, now slightly wilted. He sat down heavily and looked at the desk rather than at Poirot. "I didn't do it," he said without preamble. I have not suggested that you did," Poirot replied pleasantly. "Everyone's thinking it. The groom. It's always the groom, isn't it? In sensation novels, perhaps. I prefer to think rather than assume." He paused. "Tell me about Rosalind. How long had you known her?" 14 months. We met in London, a mutual friend's dinner party. She was the most self-possessed person I had ever met. That was the first thing I thought, that she seemed entirely sufficient to herself. And yet you wished to marry her. Because of it, partly. He gave a short, humourless sound. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds honest," Poirot said. "Were you happy in the engagement?" Edmund was quiet for a moment. "We were happy, and then, about 3 weeks ago, something changed. With Rosalind. She became watchful. As though she was waiting for something to happen. I asked her twice what was wrong. She said nothing was wrong." He looked up directly at Poirot. "She was lying. I knew it. I didn't press her, and I've spent the last 3 hours wishing to God that I had." 3 weeks ago," Poirot said quietly. "Was there any event around that time, any visitor, any letter, that might have—" "Her uncle arrived," Edmund said flatly. "Gerald Harwick. He came down from Edinburgh for a weekend visit, said he wanted to see the manor before the wedding." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Rosalind was different after that weekend. "I don't like Gerald Harwick," Edmund added after a moment. "There is something about the man that does not—" He stopped. "That is not evidence of anything. No, but it is an observation. And observations, Mr. Ashworth, are the raw material from which the truth is eventually constructed." Poirot rose, smoothing his jacket. "One final question. The name Helen, does it mean anything to you?" Edmund Ashworth went very still. It lasted only a second. Then he shook his head. "No, I don't know anyone called Helen." Poirot smiled with great politeness and noted with great precision that Edmund Ashworth's left hand had gripped the arm of the chair at the mention of the name and had not released it until the answer was given. The remaining members of the household were introduced to Poirot over the next 2 hours, and he arranged them in his mind as a man arranges furniture. Carefully, with an eye for what each piece revealed about the room as a whole, there was Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, the mother, 71, immaculately dressed, possessed of a spine constructed from some material stronger than bone. She answered every question precisely, volunteered nothing, and watched Poirot throughout with the calm, measuring look of a woman who has survived a great deal, and intends to survive this as well. Poirot noted her word for Rosalind, suitable. Not lovely, not dear. Suitable. There was Gerald Harwick, the uncle, 54, broad-shouldered, with a salesman's handshake and a fisherman's eyes, warm on the surface, patient and cold underneath. Devastated, he said, 3 times in 5 minutes. When Poirot mentioned Helen, Gerald said, "I'm sorry," and then, "No, I don't believe I know the name," and changed the subject with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been changing subjects for a very long time. There was Miss Cecily Brant, Edmund's cousin, 24, sharp-eyed, pretty in an angular way. She had been fond of Rosalind, she said, genuinely fond. She bit her thumbnail when she said it, then looked at her hand as though surprised by the gesture. There was Mr. Thomas Brant, Cecily's father, a quiet, grey man who occupied his chair as though hoping it might eventually absorb him. He had noticed nothing unusual. He was very sorry about the whole business. There was Mrs. Eda Galloway, the cook, 60 years old, built for permanence, forthright in the manner of a woman who has fed people through 2 wars and knows what matters. She'd been in the kitchen all evening. She had not heard anything unusual. She had, however, seen something. "Seen something," Poirot said with a sharpness he did not bother to conceal. "A light," Mrs. Galloway said, "in the garden, about midnight. I was up checking my bread and I looked out the kitchen window and there was a light out near the old garden wall, moving, like someone with a torch. And did you see who it was? Too foggy, but it was a person right enough, standing by the wall for a while, then going back toward the house." She folded her arms. "Which door did this person appear to re-enter?" "The side door, off the boot room, near the east corridor." Poirot was quiet for a moment. The east corridor, where the Primrose Room was located. By 2 o'clock the fog outside had not lifted, and Poirot's coffee had gone cold again. He stood at the window and thought about veils, and windows latched from the inside, and a name written in careful blue-black ink. Helen. He thought about the way Edmund's hand had gripped the chair. He thought about Gerald Harwick's eyes, patient and cold underneath all that warmth. He thought about Rosalind sitting upright in her wedding gown, the veil arranged with something that resembled tenderness. Why the veil? He thought again. It was not practical. It served no purpose in concealment. The body had been found within hours. It was not contempt. If anything, it was its opposite. It was a statement. Someone had wanted Rosalind to be found exactly as she was, dressed, veiled, composed, as though they were arranging not a crime scene but a portrait, or a message. He turned from the window. "Allô?" he said quietly, to no one in particular. Someone in this house loved her, or believed that they did, and that, he added, picking up his cold coffee and regarding it with resigned displeasure, is frequently far more dangerous than hate. He set the cup down without drinking it. There was a great deal more to do. The things families keep behind closed doors. The afternoon light at Ashworth Manor was not so much light as a suggestion of it. By 3 o'clock the fog had thickened rather than thinned, pressing itself against the windows with a persistence that Poirot was beginning to find personally offensive. He had requested that someone light the lamps in the corridor outside the study, and twice this had been forgotten, which told him something useful about the current state of the household, that it was a house in which the ordinary machinery of daily life had ceased completely, and no one quite knew how to restart it. He lit the lamp on the study desk himself, settled into the chair, and opened his small leather notebook. He uncapped his pen. He wrote 3 things: Helen, who, the window, latched from inside, no entry, no exit. The veil, arranged, not thrown, deliberate, tender even. Why? He underlined Helen twice, then he underlined why once, and sat looking at it before closing the notebook. The second round of conversations began at 3:30. He had asked Inspector Graves whether he might continue his discussions with the household in the study. Graves had agreed with the distracted generosity of a man who has too much on his plate and is grateful to have one item removed from it. He began this time with Gerald Harwick. Gerald entered with the walk of a man who considers himself at ease, shoulders back, chin level. He sat without being invited, which Poirot noted, and smiled with the particular smile of a man who has decided that the best defence is the performance of perfect cooperation. "Terrible business," Gerald said, before Poirot had spoken. "I keep seeing her at dinner last night, perfectly well, laughing at something Edmund said, and now," he shook his head, "it doesn't seem real. Grief rarely does in the early hours." Poirot opened his notebook to a clean page, pen poised. "You were close to your niece, Mr. Harwick?" "Very. She was my sister Margaret's child. Margaret died when Rosalind was 11. I became, in effect, her guardian." "And you approved of the match with Edmund Ashworth?" A brief pause. "Edmund is a decent fellow, good family, solid prospects." "That is not quite an approval," Poirot observed mildly. Gerald's smile remained in place. "I had no objections. If Rosalind was happy, I was content." "And was she? Happy?" "She seemed so." "You visited approximately 3 weeks ago," Poirot said. "A weekend visit. Did anything occur during that visit which caused you concern?" "No," Gerald said. "Nothing of that kind." Poirot nodded slowly and wrote something in his notebook. Gerald leaned forward, almost imperceptibly, trying to read it. Poirot had written the word biscuit because he had noticed that the plate was running low and intended to request more, but Gerald Harwick was not to know that. "Mr. Harwick," Poirot said, looking up, "who is Helen?" The change in Gerald's face was small. It would have been invisible to most. To Poirot it was as clear as a shout in an empty room. The eyes, a fractional widening, then an immediate closing down, the hands, completely still on the chair arms, too still, the stillness of deliberate control, the smile, gone for exactly 1 second, then back, slightly reconfigured. "I don't know anyone called Helen," Gerald said. "I told you earlier." "So you did," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "Thank you, Mr. Harwick. That will be all for the moment." Gerald rose. At the door he paused and turned back. "I want whoever did this found," he said, and for the first time Poirot heard something beneath the performance, something raw and complicated. "Whatever it takes, whatever comes out, I want them found." He left. Whatever comes out, Poirot thought. An interesting choice of words. Cecily Brant arrived quickly, almost too quickly, as though she had been waiting just outside. She sat with her ankles crossed and her eyes moving over the room with the restless energy of someone who processes anxiety through alertness. "I want to help," she said immediately. "I know everyone says that, but I genuinely—" She stopped herself. "Sorry, I talk too much when I'm nervous." "I find," Poirot said warmly, "that people who talk too much when nervous are frequently the most useful to speak with. Please, continue to be nervous." She gave a surprised, fractured laugh, then pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. "Tell me about your relationship with Rosalind," he said. "Not the formal version, the real one." "We were properly friendly, not just because of Edmund. She was easy to be with. She didn't perform, if you understand me. Most people perform, at least a little. Rosalind just was. And recently, had you noticed any change?" "Yes." Immediate. "These last few weeks she was preoccupied. We went for a walk the day before yesterday, she'd asked me particularly, and she was very quiet. I asked if she was having last-minute nerves, and she said—" Cecily stopped. "Please," Poirot said gently. She said, "Cecily, do you think a person can be punished for something they didn't know they were part of?" Her voice had gone careful and precise, the way voices go when repeating something word for word from memory, because the words have lodged like a splinter. I made some light response. "I'm ashamed of it now," Poirot wrote in his notebook. This time he actually wrote something they didn't know they were part of. "Did she mention," he said without looking up, "a person named Helen?" Cecily's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Helen? No. Wait." She was quiet a moment. "Actually, yes. It was at dinner, the night before last. Someone said something. I think it was Uncle Gerald. And Rosalind went very quiet. Afterward, when we were clearing from the table, she said something under her breath. I almost didn't hear it." "What did she say?" Cecily looked at him. "She said it was always going to come back to Helen." The room was very quiet. Outside, a bird made a single uncertain sound and fell silent. "You're certain of those words?" Poirot said. "Completely. Because I didn't understand them, and things I don't understand tend to stay with me. I was going to ask her about it." She looked down at her hands. "I kept meaning to." Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth came in at 4:15. She sat with impeccable posture and regarded him with the calm, assessing look of a woman accustomed to managing difficult situations by refusing to be managed by them. "Mr. Poirot, what conclusions have you reached?" "Mrs. Ashworth," Poirot said pleasantly, "I asked the questions. It is the most efficient arrangement." Something moved briefly behind her eyes. Amusement, possibly. She inclined her head. "Your son tells me Rosalind changed in these last weeks, that she became watchful. Edmund is observant when it suits him. Yes, I noticed it too. Did you speak with her about it?" "I am not," Eleanor said with perfect composure. "A woman given to intimate conversation." "No," Poirot agreed, looking at her. "I had gathered that." A pause. "Mrs. Ashworth, how long have you known Gerald Harwick?" The question landed quietly. Eleanor's hands, folded in her lap still as marble, shifted, just slightly. "He came with Rosalind naturally, as her uncle." "Naturally. But had you met him before Edmund and Rosalind became engaged?" A silence 2 seconds too long. "I may have encountered him at some point," she said carefully. "One meets a great many people over the years." "Of course," Poirot said agreeably. "Mrs. Ashworth, the name Helen, does it mean anything to you?" This time the reaction was unlike anything he had observed in the others. Eleanor Ashworth did not go still. She did not look away. She looked directly at Poirot, and her expression became old, as though the name had reached behind her composed surface and touched something that had been there for a very long time, waiting. "Where?" she said quietly. "Did you hear that name?" It appeared in connection with this case, in more than one context. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. The fire shifted. A log settled. Helen Voss was a young woman employed in this house in 1931. As a governess. She said it with the careful neutrality of someone dismantling a sentence word by word to ensure nothing excess escapes. "She left our employ after approximately 1 year. I've not thought of her in a very long time. And why do you suppose her name should appear now, in connection with the death of your son's bride?" Eleanor looked at him. Her eyes were dry. They had been dry all day. "I don't know," she said. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. "I think," he said gently, "that you do." She rose, smoothed her skirt with one precise gesture, and walked to the door. "Good evening, Monsieur Poirot," she said. She did not look back. He sat alone in the study for a long time afterward. The fire had burned low. The fog pressed on. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock struck 5. Then silence returned. The heavy silence of a place where ordinary life has been suspended and something grimmer has taken its place. Poirot looked at his notebook. Helen Voss, governess, Ashworth Manor, 1931. He thought about Rosalind Ferrars, 11 years old in 1931, her mother newly dead, being raised by an uncle with patient cold eyes beneath the warmth. He thought about Edmund, 8 years old in 1931, a child in this house with a governess. He thought about Eleanor Ashworth's face when the name had landed. Old, that was the word. It was always going to come back to Helen. He closed his notebook. The thing about family secrets, Poirot thought, was not that they were kept. It was that they were kept together. That was what made them so durable and so dangerous. A secret held by one person was merely a burden. A secret held by several was a structure, an architecture of silence, load-bearing, holding the shape of the family in place, and when someone threatened to demolish it, he stood up, stretched his back, which had been complaining quietly for the last hour and was now registering a more formal protest. He was 62 years old, and country house chairs were not designed for Belgian detectives with lower back sensitivities. He should have brought the small cushion from his travelling case, but had not expected, when he had accepted the invitation to attend this wedding as a guest, to find himself investigating a murder. He should have known better. He had been to 4 country house weddings in his career. 3 of them had contained a body. The 4th had contained 2. He picked up his notebook, straightened his jacket, and went to find someone who might be persuaded to make him a fresh cup of coffee. He was not optimistic, but he was persistent. It was, when one considered it, the same quality that made him good at murder investigations, the architecture of silence. The evening came to Ashworth Manor not as a gradual darkening, but as a sudden surrender, as though the fog, having waited all day with considerable patience, had finally decided that enough was enough and simply swallowed the remaining light whole. By 6 o'clock the house was entirely dependent on its lamps, and the lamps, Poirot noted with mild irritation, were not quite adequate to the task. There were shadows in the corners of every room that the light did not reach, and in those shadows the old house seemed to breathe, slowly, carefully, the way things breathe when they are trying not to be heard. He had eventually obtained a tolerable cup of coffee. Mrs. Galloway had made it herself in the kitchen, with the grim efficiency of a woman who considers proper coffee a matter of basic human dignity. She had handed it to him without comment, which he appreciated, and he had drunk it standing at the kitchen table while she moved around him with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to working around obstacles, which he supposed he was, technically being. The coffee had helped, it always did. Not merely the warmth of it, or the bitterness, but the ritual, the holding of the cup, the small, deliberate pause it enforced. Poirot had always thought better when his hands had something to do. He was thinking now about architecture. Not the stone and ivy architecture of Ashworth Manor, though that too was present in his mind, the layout of it, the corridors, the distances between rooms. No, he was thinking about the other kind, the invisible kind, the kind built from years of carefully chosen silences and carefully chosen words, and the precise, deliberate management of what was known by whom. Someone in this house had been maintaining that architecture for a very long time, and Rosalind Ferrars had found the load-bearing wall. He had requested, through Inspector Graves, who was by now operating in a state of mild bewilderment that Poirot found almost endearing, access to Rosalind's personal belongings, her travelling case, her correspondence, if any, had accompanied her to the manor, the small leather handbag she had carried at dinner the previous evening. The travelling case had been brought to the study and placed on the desk, and Poirot had gone through it with the careful, unhurried attention he gave to all physical evidence, not looking for anything specific, because looking for something specific was how one missed everything else, but simply looking. The case contained the ordinary contents of a woman preparing for a wedding and a honeymoon, clothes, neatly folded, toiletries arranged with some precision. Rosalind Ferrars had been, he was gathering, a methodical person. A small sewing kit, a novel, Daphne du Maurier, he noted, Rebecca, which struck him as an interesting choice for a bride, a pair of reading glasses in a tortoise-shell case, and at the very bottom, beneath a folded silk scarf, a bundle of letters tied with brown string. He untied them carefully. There were 11 letters in total, written on various papers, some formal cream stationery, some plain white, and one on the pale blue paper of a foreign hotel. They spanned, from the dates at the top of each, a period of approximately 4 months. The most recent was dated 3 weeks ago, which placed it during Gerald Harwick's visit to the manor. They were not love letters. They were not precisely threatening letters. They were something in between, or rather something entirely separate from both categories. They were the letters of someone who knew something and was in the process of deciding what to do with the knowledge. Careful letters, measured letters, the letters of a person who had stumbled into a room they had not meant to enter and was standing very still, trying to determine all the exits before moving. Most were unsigned. 2 were signed with a single initial, R. Rosalind herself. Then, drafts perhaps, us of letters she had intended to send, or letters she had sent and somehow retained copies of. Poirot read them twice, slowly. In the drafts, she wrote to someone she addressed only as you, a you who clearly knew what she was referring to without her needing to specify. She wrote about something she had found, something she described as the truth about Helen and what was done. She wrote that she had not known, when she had agreed to the marriage, what she was marrying into. She wrote that she did not wish to destroy anyone, but that she could not pretend she did not know what she knew. And in the final draft, dated 2 weeks ago, the most recently written of the group, she wrote, "I have given you sufficient time to come to me. You have not. I will therefore be compelled to speak after the wedding when things are settled. Ask only that you tell me the truth first, the whole of it. What happened to Helen, and why she was made to disappear, and who decided that her silence was worth purchasing. That is all I ask. The truth. Surely that is not so very much." Poirot sat with this letter for a long time. What happened to Helen? Why she was made to disappear? Not, Helen left. Not, Helen moved on. Helen was made to disappear, and her silence was worth purchasing. He placed the letters carefully together and retied the string. The picture was becoming clearer, though its edges were still obscured, like the garden beyond the window, present but not yet fully visible through the grey. Helen Voss had been a governess at Ashworth Manor in 1931. Something had happened. Something significant enough that 21 years later, the threat of its revelation had provided someone with a motive for murder. What had happened to Helen Voss? And, more pressingly, who in this house knew the answer? He found Thomas Brant in the sitting room, alone. This was mildly surprising. Thomas Brant had spent the day being the sort of person who is present without being noticeable, occupying chairs, holding cups of tea, existing in the background of every scene with the self-effacing thoroughness of a man who has made an art of not being looked at. Poirot had spoken with him briefly in the first round, and had found him smooth, grey, and apparently empty of anything useful, like a room that has been recently and thoroughly cleared. But Thomas Brant, sitting alone, in the half-dark of the sitting room with no cup of tea and no book and nothing in his hands at all, was a slightly different proposition. He looked up when Poirot entered. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, not quite fear. Something more like the expression of a man who's been waiting for a particular thing to arrive, and is experiencing the complicated relief of its finally having done so. "Monsieur Poirot," he said. "Mr. Brant." Poirot sat down across from him without ceremony. The sitting room was cold. The fire here had not been attended to since morning, and the chill had crept in gradually, the way cold always did in old houses, through the gaps and the cracks and the places where the structure was weakest. "You have been very quiet today." "I am generally a quiet man." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "I had noticed. It is, I think, a cultivated quality rather than a natural one. That there is a difference." Thomas Brant looked at him for a moment. Then something in him seemed to settle. A decision made. A weight shifted. "What do you want to know?" he said. "I want to know about Helen Voss," Poirot said. The name fell into the cold room like a stone into still water. Thomas Brant closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "I knew this would come out," he said quietly. When she was found, I thought, this is it. This is where it ends." "Tell me," Poirot said very quietly, "from the beginning." Thomas Brant spoke for 20 minutes without stopping. He spoke in the flat, careful tone of a man reciting something he has rehearsed many times in private. Not because he intended to deceive, but because he has been over it so many times in his own mind that it has worn itself smooth. Helen Voss had come to Ashworth Manor in the spring of 1931. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a clergyman from Shropshire, educated, quiet, and, Thomas Brant said this with a kind of exhausted plainness, as though the fact was simply a fact and had been one for long enough that the emotion had worn off it, extraordinarily beautiful. She had been employed as governess to Edmund, who was 8, and to Cecily, who was 5 and had come to stay at the manor for several months while her own parents were travelling. She had been at Ashworth for 4 months when the trouble began. The trouble, Thomas Brant said, was that 2 men in the house had fallen in love with her, or believed they had. The first was himself. He said this without particular shame, in the tone of a man confessing to a thing he stopped lying to himself about long ago. He had been 33, unhappily married, susceptible, and Helen had been, he paused here, present in a way that certain people are, that makes everyone around them feel slightly more alive. He had said nothing to her, had done nothing, but had felt it privately and carried the feeling with him for 21 years with the resigned faithfulness of someone who has nowhere better to put it. The second man, Thomas Brant said, had not been so restrained. Who? Poirot said, though he suspected he already knew. Gerald Harwick, Thomas said. He was visiting that summer, a friend of the family. He knew the Ashworths socially before Rosalind was ever in the picture, before his sister Margaret had even met the man she'd eventually marry. He paused. Gerald was 25, charming, persuasive, and Helen was... She was young and far from home, and I think she was lonely, and he was very persuasive. There was a relationship, Poirot said. There was, for several months, and then... Thomas stopped. His jaw worked slightly. And then Eleanor Ashworth found out. The rest of it came in pieces, like a structure being carefully disassembled, each piece removed in turn, the shape of the whole becoming clearer with each removal. Eleanor Ashworth had found out about Gerald and Helen in September of 1931. Poirot did not ask how. It didn't matter. Eleanor Ashworth was the kind of woman who found out things eventually, because she watched everything and forgot nothing and had the patience of someone who has decided that knowledge is the only reliable currency. What Eleanor had found out was not merely that Gerald and Helen were involved. What Eleanor had found out was that Helen was with child, Gerald's child. Eleanor's response, Thomas Brant said, with the quietness of someone describing something they have never fully reconciled, was immediate and thorough. Helen was dismissed, paid very generously, more than generously, enough to constitute what anyone paying attention might call a purchase. She was given a letter of reference that said nothing about the real reasons for her departure. She was put on a train to London within 48 hours. And the child, Poirot said. Thomas Brant looked at the cold fireplace. A girl, he said. Born the following spring. Gerald did not acknowledge her. Eleanor had made it very clear to him what acknowledgement would cost. Socially, financially, in terms of the Ashworth family's considerable capacity for making a man's life in certain circles quite impossible. He paused. The child was given up, placed with a family. Helen, we were told she left England, gone abroad. No one heard from her again. The sitting room was very quiet. The child, Poirot said carefully, who was born in the spring of 1932. Yes. Mr. Brant, Rosalind Ferrers. Do you know when she was born? Thomas Brant turned and looked at Poirot with an expression that contained in equal measure exhaustion and relief, and a grief that had clearly been sitting in him all day, waiting to be acknowledged. April, he said, 1932. The fire was dead. The fog pressed on outside. Somewhere in the house a door closed softly. Poirot sat with the knowledge settling over him like the fog itself. Inevitable, gradual, and, once arrived, total. Rosalind Ferrers had not simply been Edmund Ashworth's bride. She had been Gerald Harwick's daughter, which meant she'd been coming to this house to marry her own, he calculated it carefully and felt the cold of it, her own half-brother, and someone in this house had known. He found Cecily in the corridor 20 minutes later. She was standing at the window at the corridor's end, looking out at nothing, arms wrapped around herself, and she turned when she heard his footsteps with the look of someone who has been waiting to be found. You know, don't you? She said. It was not a question. I am beginning to, Poirot said. Mademoiselle Brant. Did Rosalind tell you? On that walk 2 days ago? Cecily was quiet for a long moment. The fog was absolute beyond the glass. There was nothing out there. No garden, and no wall, no world, just grey. "Not everything," she said finally. "She told me she'd discovered something about her own birth, that her family was not what she'd believed it to be, that coming to this house, she said, was like walking into the middle of a story she hadn't known she was already in." Cecily pressed her fingers against the cold glass. "She didn't tell me the specifics. I think she was still deciding who she could trust." "She trusted you," Poirot said gently. "Not quite enough," Cecily said. "Or perhaps too much to want to burden me with it." She turned from the window. "She wasn't going to go through with the wedding," Cecily said quietly. "Was she? That's what the letters were. She was going to stop it." "I believe so," Poirot said. "So someone stopped her first?" "Yes," Poirot said. The words sat between them in the cold corridor, plain and terrible. "Monsieur Poirot," Cecily said, and her voice had gone to something very careful and very young. "Who knew? Who in this house knew what she had found out?" Poirot looked at her. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely the right question." He did not answer it yet, but he was very close. Back in the study, alone, Poirot sat with his notebook open and his pen uncapped, and did not write anything for a full 5 minutes. He was thinking about the veil. Always the veil. He had not been able to let go of it. The deliberate, careful arrangement of it over Rosalind's face. The tenderness of it. He had said earlier, to no one in particular, that love was more dangerous than hate. And he had meant it. And he still meant it. But he was beginning to think it was more complicated than even that. Because the veil suggested something specific. It suggested that the person who had arranged it had known who Rosalind was. Not just Edmund's bride, not just the woman who threatened to expose a secret, but who she actually was. Her true identity, the thing she had only recently discovered herself. And the veil, the wedding veil, arranged with such deliberate, terrible care over the face of a bride who would never be a bride, was a statement about that identity. "You were a bride," it said. "I am acknowledging that. I am honouring it in the only way left to me." Or, "You were never a bride," it said. "Not really, and I am covering the evidence of what you truly were." The ambiguity of it troubled him. He wrote in his notebook, "The veil is grief, or the veil is concealment. It cannot be both. Which one?" Then he wrote beneath it, "Who in this house loved her? Not as a bride, as herself." He stared at the question, then slowly he wrote one name. He looked at the name for a long moment. Then he closed the notebook, stood up, straightened his jacket with both hands, a gesture that was partly habit and partly the physical equivalent of collecting oneself, and went to find Inspector Graves. There was one more piece of information he required, and it was not a piece that could be obtained by conversation. It required a telephone call, and a name, and a registry of births in the county of London for the year 1932. What the veil was a whispering. The telephone was in the entrance hall. It was an old instrument, heavy black bakelite, the kind that felt substantial in the hand, that had the quality of a thing built to last rather than merely to function. It sat on a narrow table beside the hall stand, and the hall stand held 7 coats belonging to 7 different people, and Poirot stood before the telephone for a moment and looked at the coats and thought, not for the first time that day, about the particular intimacy of a house in which people have gathered for a celebration, and found instead a catastrophe. 7 coats. 7 people who had dressed that morning with some expectation of joy, or at least of occasion, and had instead spent the day being questioned by a Belgian detective in a cold study, while a young woman lay upstairs behind her veil, and the fog refused to lift. He picked up the telephone. The call took 40 minutes and required 3 separate transfers, first to the local constabulary's records office, then to Somerset House in London, then to a woman named Miss Philippa Arden, who worked in the registry division, and who had, Poirot gathered from her voice, been about to leave for the evening and was not entirely pleased to have been prevented from doing so. He apologised with great warmth and considerable charm. Miss Philippa Arden thawed somewhat. She confirmed what he needed confirmed. He thanked her with the sincerity of a man who genuinely means it and replaced the receiver carefully. He stood in the entrance hall for a moment, and 7 coats at his peripheral vision, the house breathing quietly around him, and felt the particular sensation he had felt perhaps 200 times in his career. The sensation of a thing clicking into place, not dramatically, not with any flourish, simply the quiet, definitive sound of a mechanism completing itself. Voila, he thought. He knew who had killed Rosalind Ferrers. He knew why. He knew now what the veil had been whispering. The remaining question, The only remaining question was how to proceed. Because knowing a thing and being able to demonstrate it were two separate matters, and Poirot had learned, over his long career, that the distance between them was frequently where the most important work occurred. He needed one more conversation. He needed to look into one more pair of eyes and ask one more question. And then he would be ready. He found Gerald Harwick in the library. This surprised him slightly. Not that Gerald was in the library, but that Gerald was actually reading, or appeared to be reading. He was seated in the largest of the leather armchairs with a book open in his lap, and he looked up when Poirot entered with an expression of mild, composed inquiry that Poirot recognized immediately as the expression of a man who's been sitting in a chair, rehearsing how he will look when someone enters. The book, Poirot noted, was upside down. He chose not to mention this. "Monsieur Poirot," Gerald said, setting the book aside with the casual ease of a man who has been reading perfectly normally and is simply done with it now. "Another conversation? A brief one," Poirot said. He did not sit. He stood in the centre of the library with his hands clasped behind his back, which was a posture he adopted when he wished to think clearly and move quickly if necessary. "I have been making inquiries, Mr. Harwick. Telephone inquiries of a bureaucratic nature, registry offices, birth records." Gerald said nothing. His face was very still. "I have confirmed," Poirot said quietly, "that a child named Rosalind Margaret Voss was born in the London borough of Lambeth on the 14th of April 1932. The mother was recorded as Helen Mary Voss, formerly of Shropshire. The father was recorded as unknown." He paused. "This child was subsequently adopted at the age of 4 months by a family named Ferrers of Hertfordshire." The library was very quiet. Gerald Harwick sat in the large leather chair and looked at Poirot, and for the first time all day the performance was entirely gone, not peeled away, not cracked, but simply absent, as though it had used up all its energy and simply stopped. What was underneath was not what Poirot had expected. It was not guilt exactly, it was not fear, it was grief, old grief, the kind that has been carried so long it has become structural, part of the skeleton of a person, impossible to remove without the whole collapsing. "You knew," Poirot said. Not an accusation, simply a statement. "I found out," Gerald said in a voice that was very quiet and very tired. 2 years ago, Helen died. In France, she'd been living in Lyon. She left. There were papers. She'd kept records. Everything." He stopped. "I had a daughter. I'd always known, in the abstract, that there was a child. Eleanor had told me the child had been placed. I had let myself not think about it. For 20 years I had let myself not think about it." His voice was steady, but it cost him something. "And then I found out she was alive, that she was Rosalind, that she was about to marry..." He stopped. "About to marry Edmund Ashworth," Poirot finished. "Your daughter. About to marry the son of the woman who had paid her mother to disappear. About to marry, in effect, into the family that had, as Rosalind herself put it, made her mother disappear. She didn't know," Gerald said. "When Edmund proposed, when she accepted, she didn't know any of it. She was just a young woman who had met a young man. She had no idea who she was, who her real parents were, what the connection was. And you," Poirot said carefully, "told her." Gerald Harwick looked at his hands. "I came here 3 weeks ago," he said, "to this house, to tell her. I had been working up to it for 2 years. What to say? How to say it? How to tell a woman of 20 that everything she believed about herself was... I agonized over it, Monsieur Poirot. Whatever you think of me, I agonized." "I do not doubt it," Poirot said, and meant it. "I told her on the Sunday morning before I left, in the garden. We walked along the east wall and I told her," a long pause. She was extraordinary. She didn't scream, she didn't collapse, she just went very still, the way she did, and listened, and when I was finished she said, 'I need to think.'" His voice caught slightly on the last word, just slightly. "And I left, and I told myself I had done the right thing. Yes, that she deserved to know, that I was finally, after 20 years of nothing, doing something right by her. But she did not simply think," Poirot said. "She began instead to investigate. She found the letters, or wrote letters. She confronted someone." "I didn't know that," Gerald said. "I didn't know how far she'd gone with it until I arrived here 2 days ago and saw her face. She'd found something more than what I'd told her, something I didn't even know. He looked up at Poirot directly. What had she found? Poirot was quiet for a moment. She had found, he said carefully, that Helen Voss's disappearance was not merely managed. She had found evidence that Helen did not leave willingly, that the payment Eleanor Ashworth made to her was not precisely a severance, that there was coercion involved, possibly, and I say possibly because the evidence is incomplete, something more than coercion. Gerald stared at him. What are you saying? I am saying, Poirot said, that Rosalind Ferrars believed, in these last weeks, that her mother had not merely been paid to disappear, but had been threatened, frightened into silence in ways that went beyond money, and that the person who had done this was still in this house. The fire in the library grate gave a soft collapsing sound, a log giving way. Gerald's face had gone very still again, but it was a different stillness from earlier. This was not the stillness of performance. This was the stillness of a man absorbing something that is rearranging him from the inside. Eleanor, he said, not a question. She came to you, Poirot said. In 1931, she told you to end it. To send Helen away. And you complied, because Eleanor Ashworth was a woman of considerable power, and you were 25 years old and you were afraid of her. Yes, Gerald said, barely audible. But it was not Eleanor who killed Rosalind, Poirot said. Gerald looked up sharply. Poirot held his gaze. No, Poirot said quietly. Eleanor Ashworth is many things, but she is not. She is not the author of this particular act. He paused. And neither are you. Gerald's breath released in something that was not quite a sound. Then who? That, Poirot said. I will explain. Tomorrow morning. To everyone. Together. He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. Mr. Harwick, you came here 3 weeks ago and told your daughter the truth about who she was. Whatever else is true of you, as whatever failures of courage occurred in 1931, that act was not a failure. Gerald Harwick said nothing, but something in his face shifted, old and tired and complicated, and beneath all of it, fractionally, tentatively, almost afraid to be, grateful. Poirot did not sleep well. This was not unusual when a case was at this stage, the stage where the shape of the truth was entirely clear, but the final movement, the confrontation, the moment of revelation had not yet occurred. He had always found this stage the most uncomfortable, not because he doubted his conclusions. His little grey cells had never, in 40 years, led him seriously astray, and he saw no reason to begin distrusting them now, but because of what came after the revelation, the human wreckage of it, the faces. He had seen a great many faces in the moment of unmasking. He had never found it easy. He lay in the guest room, the west guest room, not the east corridor, not anywhere near the primrose room, which had been sealed since the afternoon, and listened to the house and thought about the sequence of it all. Rosalind had discovered who she was 3 weeks ago. She had spent 3 weeks processing it, investigating, writing letters. To whom? Not Gerald, not Eleanor directly. To the person she suspected of knowing the worst of it. The person who had, she believed, not merely facilitated her mother's disappearance, but actively, knowingly, permitted something irreversible to happen to Helen Voss. She had been going to speak after the wedding. She had said so in the draft letter. I will be compelled to speak when things are settled. But the person she had written to had not waited for after the wedding. They had come to her the night before. Poirot thought about the figure Mrs. Galloway had seen in the garden, moving through the fog with a torch near the east wall at midnight, returning through the side door, the east corridor. He thought about the window, latched from the inside, which meant the killer had entered through the door, had knocked perhaps, or had a key, had been admitted even. Had Rosalind opened the door herself, believing it was someone she could trust? He thought about the veil arranged with such care, such deliberate, terrible care. He thought about what the veil meant now that he knew what he knew, and he understood it. Finally, completely, he understood it. It was not grief, it was not concealment, it was both, and braided together in a single act by a person who was both grieving and concealing simultaneously. A person who had loved Rosalind, in their way, and had killed her anyway. Not despite the love, but in some terrible and twisted logic because of it. Because of what knowing the truth would do, not to the killer, to everyone else. I am protecting something, the veil said. I am sorry. I am protecting something that matters more than you do. And I am covering your face because I cannot bear to look at what I have done." Poirot stared at the ceiling of the West guest room and felt the sadness of it settle over him. The particular sadness of a truth that explains everything and excuses nothing. He had the answer, all of it. At 7 a.m, he rose, dressed with his customary care. He would not, under any circumstances, face a murderer with an improperly knotted tie, and went downstairs. Mrs. Galloway was already in the kitchen. She made him coffee without being asked, and it was good coffee, properly good, and he drank it in silence while she moved around him, and the fog outside the kitchen window, finally imperceptibly, almost reluctantly, began to thin, not gone, but thinning. The first pale suggestion of actual light touched the kitchen windowsill at 7:05, and Poirot looked at it for a moment. Then he set down his cup. "Mrs. Galloway," he said, "would you be so good as to ask Inspector Graves and the members of the household to gather in the sitting room at 9 o'clock? She looked at him. She was a woman who read situations accurately and quickly, and she read this one without difficulty. "You know who did it," she said. Not a question." "I know," Poirot said. She nodded once with the decisive practicality of someone filing a fact in the correct place. "I'll tell them," she said. "Thank you." He rose and carried his cup to the sink, a small gesture, unnecessary, but he preferred to leave things orderly when possible. "Monsieur Poirot," Mrs. Galloway said as he turned to go. He paused. "Will it be very bad," she said, "when you tell them?" He considered the question honestly, as he considered all questions. "Yes," he said. "I think it will be rather bad." She nodded again. "Right then," she said, and turned back to her stove. By 8:45, the fog had thinned enough that the garden was partially visible from the sitting room windows, grey and wet and bedraggled, the rose bushes bent under the weight of accumulated moisture, the gravel dark. But visible. The world tentatively returning. The household assembled with the reluctant, shuffling energy of people who know something significant is coming and are not certain they wish to receive it. Edmund came in first and stood near the fireplace. Eleanor arrived and sat with her usual composure in the chair nearest the door. Poirot noted the positioning. Gerald came in and sat as far from Eleanor as the room permitted. Thomas Brant arrived with Cecily, who had clearly not slept and was working very hard not to show it. Reverend Miles appeared briefly in the doorway, was regarded by almost everyone with a look that communicated clearly that his presence was not required, and withdrew with quiet dignity. Inspector Graves stood near the window with his notebook open, and the expression of a man who is not entirely sure what he is about to witness, but is professionally committed to witnessing it regardless. Dottie had been asked to remain in the kitchen. She had not argued. Poirot stood in the centre of the room. He looked at each face in turn: Edmund, Eleanor, Gerald, Thomas, Cecily. One of them knew what was coming. One of them had spent the night with it. "I thank you all," Poirot said, "for your patience and your cooperation in what has been, I am fully aware, an extraordinarily painful day." He clasped his hands behind his back. "I will not take more of your time than is necessary. I will simply tell you what happened to Rosalind Ferrars. I will tell you the truth of it, all of it, including the history that made it possible. Some of what I say will be painful. I ask you to remain and to listen, because the truth, however difficult, is owed to her." He paused. The sitting room was absolutely quiet. Outside, a pale, watery sun, the first in 2 days, touched the garden wall and moved slowly as though uncertain of its welcome. Rosalind Ferrars, Poirot said, was not who she believed herself to be. She was not the daughter of a couple named Ferrars of Hertfordshire, though she was raised as such. She was the daughter of Helen Voss, a young woman employed as governess in this house in 1931, and of a man who was, at that time, a guest of the Ashworth family. He looked at Gerald. Gerald held his gaze. He had the look of a man who has decided to hold still through a thing that might otherwise break him. She was adopted as an infant, and spent 20 years with no knowledge of her true origins. 3 weeks ago, she was told the truth, by her biological father during his visit to this house. A sound from Edmund, not quite a word. He looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at him steadily. Upon learning this, Poirot continued, Rosalind did not immediately withdraw from the engagement. She began instead to investigate. She wished to understand not merely who she was, but what had happened to her mother. She discovered, through means I've not been able to entirely establish, but which likely involved correspondence with persons who had been in service at this house in 1931, that Helen Voss's departure had not been entirely voluntary. He turned slightly. She discovered that Helen had been coerced, that the payment made to her had been accompanied by a threat that involved not merely Helen's livelihood but her safety, that someone in this house had made it very clear to Helen Voss that silence was not optional, and that the consequences of breaking it would be severe. Rosalind wrote to the person she believed responsible for this. She asked for the truth. She said she would speak after the wedding. She gave notice, as it were. She was not intending to destroy anyone. She simply wanted the truth acknowledged. He paused. The person she wrote to did not come forward with the truth. Instead, they came to her room in the early hours of the 14th of October. They knocked. I believe she opened the door herself because she knew them, and perhaps because she had been expecting some response to her letter. They spoke, and then he stopped, looked at the window. The pale sun moved another inch across the garden wall. And then they killed her, and they arranged her veil over her face with great care because they had loved her in their way, or loved the idea of her, and they could not leave her otherwise. And then they went out through the garden in the fog and came back through the side door and went to their room and waited for morning. The sitting room was absolutely, completely still. The veil, Poirot said quietly, was the mistake. Not a forensic mistake. It left no evidence that pointed anywhere definitive. But it was a human mistake, because it told me something about the killer that nothing else had. It told me they were not cold. It told me they had not acted out of pure self-interest or calculated strategy. It told me they had acted out of love. A terrible, destructive, self-serving love, but love nonetheless. The love of a person who has decided that what they are protecting matters more than the life they're taking, and who still, even in the act of it, cannot quite stop caring. He turned. He looked directly at Eleanor Ashworth. Eleanor Ashworth sat in her chair with her perfect posture and her dry eyes and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked back at him, and for a long moment the room held its breath. Then Poirot said, "But it was not you, Mrs. Ashworth." A sharp intake of breath from somewhere. Edmund, possibly. Poirot turned again. He looked at Thomas Brant. Thomas Brant was sitting very still. He was grey in the way that he always was. Quiet in the way that he always was, present without being noticeable in the way that he always was, but his hands in his lap were shaking, barely, almost invisibly, almost. "Mr. Brant," Poirot said very quietly, "you loved Helen Voss." Thomas Brant said nothing. "You loved her, and you did nothing. You told me this yourself. You felt it privately and carried it privately, and watched Gerald Harwick pursue her, and watched Eleanor Ashworth destroy her, and you did nothing. And you have carried that nothing for 21 years. Still nothing. And then Rosalind came to this house, and you saw Helen in her. Not vaguely, specifically. The way she held herself, the quality of her stillness, the particular way she was, present. You told me yourself. Helen had a quality of presence that made people feel more alive. A sound from Thomas Brant. Not a word. Rosalind wrote to you, Poirot said. You were the person she wrote to. Not Eleanor. Eleanor was the architect of what happened to Helen, yes, but Rosalind had concluded from whatever she had learned that there was someone else. Someone who had known, who had been there, who had not acted. Someone who owed her mother something. You. Thomas Brant's hands had stopped shaking. They were still now. Everything about him was still. She asked you for the truth. The whole truth. What happened to Helen? Why she was made to disappear? What the coercion had been? And you could not give it to her. Poirot's voice was very quiet. Not because you did not know, but because telling her the full truth would have required you to tell her what you yourself had done in 1931, which was not merely to watch Helen be destroyed. A long pause. You were the one, Mr. Brant, who told Eleanor. You saw Gerald and Helen together, and you told Eleanor Ashworth because you were jealous, and you were weak, and you believed, perhaps, that if Gerald were removed from the picture, something might yet be possible. You did not anticipate what Eleanor would do, or perhaps you half anticipated it and permitted yourself not to think clearly about it. Either way, you were the beginning of it, the first domino. Thomas Brant's face had gone beyond grey into something translucent, something that looked as though the bones had moved too close to the surface. Rosalind's letter told you she knew about the coercion. It did not tell you she knew about your role, but you could not be certain. You could not risk it. And so, she looked like her, Thomas Brandt said. The room froze. His voice was very quiet, almost conversational, as though he were simply making an observation. Every time I looked at her, he said, I saw Helen, the way she moved, the way she listened. I had spent 20 years, I had, and then she was here, in this house, and she was going to tell everything, and what I had done would... He stopped. I couldn't let her. I couldn't have it all, have Helen looked at, dissected, reduced to a scandal, a family secret, she deserved better than that. Helen deserved better than to become a... Mr. Brandt, Inspector Graves said from the window. His voice was firm and not unkind. I must ask you to stop speaking without... I covered her face, Thomas Brandt said, as though Graves had not spoken. He was looking at Poirot, only at Poirot. Because I couldn't look at her and see Helen looking back at me from... I covered her face because I was sorry. Because I have always been sorry. The room was absolutely still. Outside, the pale sun moved fully clear of the garden wall for the first time in 2 days, and the wet garden gleamed faintly, and somewhere out there a bird, encouraged by the light, began to sing. What remains? When the fog lifts... They took Thomas Brandt away at 10:30. He went quietly. This was, Poirot thought, entirely in keeping with the man, a man who had moved through his entire life quietly, occupying the background of every scene, causing devastation in whispers rather than shouts. He walked between the two constables with the shuffling gait of someone from whom something structural has been removed, and he did not look back at the house, and he did not look at any of the faces in the doorway. The only moment he paused was at the threshold, the front door of Ashworth Manor, where he stopped for just a second, as though registering the feel of the place one last time. Then he went through it, and the car moved slowly down the gravel drive and was gone. Poirot stood in the doorway and watched until the sound of the engine faded. Then he went inside. The house was very quiet, not the heavy, watchful quiet of the previous day. This was a different quiet, the quiet of aftermath, of a thing concluded. It had the texture of silence that follows a long storm, not peaceful exactly, but emptied, wrung out. Edmund Ashworth was in the front parlour, standing at the window, his back to the room. He still had the white carnation in his buttonhole, wilted now to something papery and brown at the edges, and Poirot thought that of all the small images of the last 24 hours, this one would stay with him longest. The wilted carnation, the wedding that had not happened, the groom standing at the window in his morning coat looking out at a garden he could finally see. Poirot went first to the kitchen. Mrs. Galloway was at her table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, not drinking it. She looked up when he came in. Thomas Brandt, she said flatly. Yes. I've known that man 15 years, she said. He came to this house every Christmas, sat at that table. She looked at the kitchen table as though it had done something to offend her. You never know, do you? No, Poirot said honestly. One rarely does. Will he hang? That will be for the court to determine. His confession was voluntary and full, the circumstances, the history, or a good defence counsel will present them. Mrs. Galloway nodded slowly. That poor girl, she said. Coming to this house not knowing any of it, walking straight into the middle of it. Yes, Poirot said, and her mother before her. Yes. She set down her cup. Is there anything else you need from me? No. You have been throughout this business the most consistently useful person in the house. I am grateful. She looked at him with the expression of a woman not accustomed to being told this. Go on, she said, with the brusque affection of someone who expresses warmth primarily through dismissal. He went. Gerald Harwick was in the garden. He was standing on the path near the east wall, hands in the pockets of his overcoat, looking at nothing in particular. Poirot pulled his own coat tighter. He had not fully warmed up since arriving at this house. An English country house heating was a subject on which he had strong and consistent views, and walked out to him. They stood together for a moment in the thin, pale morning light. She knew, Gerald said without preamble. At the end, she knew who she was. Yes, Poirot said. I keep thinking about that walk. 3 weeks ago, along this wall. Gerald looked at the old stones of it, mossy, permanent. She listened to everything I told her, and then she said, So this is why I've always felt like I was looking for something. Just like that. Quiet. No hysterics. Just recognition. His voice was controlled, but it cost him. She was remarkable. Helen was remarkable, and Rosalind was remarkable, and I—" He stopped. "I failed them both," he said. "In every way a man can fail two people." "You told her," Poirot said, "when you could have continued not telling her. When it would have been considerably easier for you to continue not telling her. You came to this house and walked along this wall and gave her the truth about herself. That was not nothing, Mr. Harwick." "It got her killed," Gerald said. "No," Poirot said firmly. "Thomas Brandt's cowardice, 21 years of it, accumulated and compounded, got her killed. What you did was give your daughter her identity. The fact that someone chose to respond to that with violence is not something you caused." Gerald said nothing, but something in his shoulders shifted fractionally, the very beginning of the possibility of not carrying quite all of it. "I'd like to be involved," Gerald said quietly, "in the burial. Someone should see to that properly, if they'll permit it." "I think," Poirot said, "that you have every right to be involved." Gerald nodded once. He put his hands back in his pockets and walked toward the house, and Poirot stood alone by the east wall for a while, looking at the place where the fog had been, and thinking about Helen Voss, who had walked along this same path in 1931 and had not known what was coming. Edmund was still at the parlour window when Poirot found him. The carnation was gone now, removed at some point, lying on the windowsill the small brown wreckage of a morning's intention. He turned when Poirot came in with the face of a man who has received too much information in too short a time. "She was going to call it off," he said. "The wedding, wasn't she?" "I believe she had not yet fully decided. She had given herself until after the wedding to speak, which suggests she had not entirely closed the door. But she was deeply troubled. The weight of what she knew was very heavy." Edmund turned back to the window. "I loved her," he said, "whatever she was to me, whoever she was." "I know," Poirot said. "I didn't protect her." "You could not have known. I knew something was wrong," Edmund said with quiet fierceness. "I knew it for 3 weeks and I didn't press her. I told myself I was being respectful of her privacy, and what I was actually being was a coward." A pause. "Not as catastrophic a coward as Thomas Brandt, but the same species of thing." Poirot looked at him. Edmund Ashworth, 29, in his wedding clothes, holding himself accountable with the clear-eyed mercilessness of someone who has decided to be honest with himself regardless of cost. "The capacity for that kind of honesty," Poirot said quietly, "is not nothing, Mr. Ashworth. It is in fact rather rare. Do not waste it." Edmund said nothing, but he heard it. He found Cecily sitting on the floor of the upstairs corridor, not against the wall, or not near any room, just on the floor, knees drawn up, back straight, in the way of someone who has run out of appropriate places to put themselves. She looked up when Poirot appeared. After a moment, with the careful, effortful movement of a 62-year-old man with lower back sensitivities, Poirot lowered himself to sit beside her. She stared at him. "Monsieur Poirot, I find," he said, settling himself, "that floors are underrated for thinking." Despite everything, despite the day and the weight of it and the sleepless night written on her face, she almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but almost. "My father," she said. "What happens to him?" "He will face trial. The full truth, his role in 1931, his reasons, the history, will be before the court. Confession and the complexity of the circumstances, will be taken into account." "He loved her," Cecily said quietly. "Helen. My mother always knew, I think. He was never really all the way present in his own life. Like part of him had stayed somewhere else a long time ago." A pause. "I just didn't know where." "Now you do," Poirot said. "Now I do." They sat in silence, the two of them, on the floor of the upper corridor, in the thin October light finally coming properly through the windows. "She wasn't going to go through with the wedding," Cecily said. "Was she?" "I believe she was still deciding," Poirot said carefully. "But she was going to speak, that much is certain." "So someone spoke first?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "She asked me on that walk whether a person could be punished for something they didn't know they were part of. I've been thinking about it all night." Cecily pressed her fingers against her knee. "I think she wasn't asking about herself. I think she was asking about all of us. Whether we, the people who came after, who inherited the shape of what our parents did, whether we owed something." "And do you think we do?" Poirot asked. "I think we don't get to choose what we inherit," she said slowly. "But we get to choose what we do with it." A pause. She was going to do something with it. Someone should finish that, make sure it doesn't go back into the dark. Poirot looked at her, sharp-eyed, sleepless, with the particular steadiness of someone who has just decided something. "Yes," he said, "I think someone should." He left Ashworth Manor at noon. He stood for a moment on the front step. The fog was gone. Entirely, finally, completely gone. The sky was a pale, washed blue. The particular blue of English October at its best, rare and temporary. The garden gleamed. The oaks along the eastern wall were visible again, enormous and faintly golden at their edges. Even the weather vane atop the stable roof had reappeared. The world had come back. Inspector Graves appeared behind him with his notebook and the air of a man beginning to comprehend the full extent of his paperwork. "You'll make yourself available, should we need a full written statement," Poirot said, "thorough and accurate, on your desk within the week." Graves nodded. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." "Thank you, Inspector. You conducted yourself with admirable patience throughout." This was generous, and they both knew it. Graves straightened slightly. "Just doing the job," he said. "Indeed," Poirot agreed, and walked down the front steps for the last time. The car to the station moved through Corton Village. Fields grey-green and damp, hedgerows thick, farmhouses set back from the road with chimneys smoking companionably. The ordinary world going about its ordinary business, entirely indifferent to the events at Ashworth Manor. Poirot looked out the window. He thought about Cecily, on the floor of the corridor, clear-eyed and decided. He thought she would finish what Rosalind had started. He hoped Edmund would find his way back to something resembling a life. He hoped Gerald would be permitted to bury his daughter. He hoped Eleanor Ashworth would sit in whatever time she had remaining, with what she'd done in 1931 and find it insufficient comfort. He thought about the veil. Always the veil. He understood it completely now. And understanding it completely made it worse rather than better, which was frequently the case with the truth. Thomas Brandt had arranged it because he had seen Helen in Rosalind's face. All the love he had carried privately for 21 years, deposited finally and uselessly onto the face of the woman he had just murdered. The most human thing about the whole terrible business, and the most damning. The station appeared, small, provincial, with flower boxes on the platform still holding late marigolds, orange and yellow, improbably cheerful. Poirot got out, stood on the platform, looked at the marigolds. Rosalind Ferrars had been 20 years old, and had spent the last weeks of her life trying to bring the truth into the light. She had not managed it herself, but it had come into the light anyway. He supposed that was something. The truth had a quality of persistence more durable than any architecture of silence built to contain it. It found its way through, eventually, through the cracks, through the gaps, through the places where the structure was weakest, the way cold did in old houses, the way fog did in October, the way light was doing now across the station platform, unhurried and complete. The train arrived. Poirot picked up his bag, straightened his coat and touched the brim of his hat, a small, entirely private farewell to a young woman he had never met alive. Then he stepped aboard. The doors closed, the train moved, and Ashworth Manor, with its fog and its veil and its 21 years of silence, fell away behind him into the pale English afternoon.